Chapter 21, Direct SPM Supplementation versus Precursor Strategy. The question of direct SPM supplementation versus precursor strategy forces a deeper clarification of what kind of biological problem is actually being addressed. If the body is struggling with inflammation because it cannot generate enough late-phase signals from its own tissue reservoirs, then the idea of providing finished or semi-finished pro-resolving mediators appears attractive. It promises to bypass slow membrane remodeling, bypass weak conversion, and deliver the stop signal more directly. But that promise has to be evaluated carefully because inflammation is not solved only by dropping a late-phase signal into the system. The body does not merely need an instruction to resolve. It needs membranes capable of storing the right substrate, tissues capable of receiving the instruction, immune cells capable of carrying out cleanup, barriers capable of reclosing, and mitochondria capable of funding repair. Direct SPM strategies and precursor strategies therefore solve different parts of the same problem. One acts closer to the downstream signal layer. The other acts at the level of structural preparation and long-horizon tissue remodeling. Neither should be confused for the whole answer. A precursor strategy works by rebuilding the reservoir. EPA and DHA are supplied, absorbed, transported, and incorporated into phospholipid membranes, where they gradually change the structural and signaling potential of tissue. Over time, this alters substrate competition, changes what phospholipids will later release during inflammatory activation, and increases the body's ability to generate resolvins, protectins, and maresins from within. The great strength of this strategy is that it respects the architecture of physiology. It does not merely add a signal. It changes the material from which future signals are built. That matters because chronic inflammatory disease is usually not only a signaling problem. It is a membrane problem, a threshold problem, a barrier problem, and a cleanup problem. Precursor strategy works more slowly, but when it works well, it changes the starting conditions of the next inflammatory event, not just the visible tone of the current one. The body becomes harder to trigger unnecessarily and better equipped to finish what it starts. The limitation of precursor strategy is that it is indirect. EPA and DHA have to be meaningfully incorporated. They have to survive oxidative stress. They have to compete successfully with omega-6 dominant substrate pools. They have to move through COX and LOX bottlenecks. They have to be converted at the right phase. The tissue has to remain stable enough that SPM generation can actually matter once it occurs. This makes precursor strategy highly dependent on the quality of the terrain. A person can take omega-3 for a long time and still get only partial resolution benefit if membranes remain oxidatively unstable, if gut or vascular barriers keep re-triggering the inflammatory program, if the body remains too crowded by arachidonic acid-heavy chemistry, or if macrophage cleanup and mitochondrial function remain poor. Precursor strategy is therefore powerful but conditional. It builds capacity rather than guaranteeing immediate downstream expression. Direct SPM supplementation tries to solve the problem from the other end. Instead of waiting for tissue to absorb EPA and DHA, remodel membranes, release substrate, and convert it enzymatically, it attempts to provide later-phase mediators or mediator-like molecules more directly. The theoretical advantage is obvious. It may bypass some of the slow structural steps and some of the enzymatic bottlenecks. It may offer a way to increase pro-resolving signaling even in tissues that are poor at generating those mediators on their own. This is especially appealing in conditions marked by severe resolution failure, where the body still inflames strongly but seems chronically unable to activate the stop signal with enough force to change the direction of the event. In that context, direct SPM delivery looks like a way to inject more phase transition pressure into a system stuck in escalation. But the limitations are equally important. Direct SPM supplementation is downstream by design, and downstream strategies are always limited by the state of the structure receiving them. A signal can arrive in a tissue that is too oxidized, too debris-laden, too barrier-leaky, too omega-6 dominant, or too metabolically underpowered to act on that signal well. In other words, giving the body more stop signals does not necessarily rebuild the membrane reservoir, reduce omega-6 competition, correct phospholipid composition, or improve the tissue's long-term ability to generate its own resolution chemistry. It may improve later phase instruction temporarily, but if the body remains structurally underbuilt for closure, then the intervention risks becoming dependent on repeated external supply rather than producing a durable reprogramming of tissue behavior. Direct SPMs may help tell the body what to do. They do not necessarily change what the body is made from. This difference becomes especially important when thinking about time horizon. Precursor strategy is slower because it works through membrane remodeling and future inflammatory potential. Direct SPM strategy is conceptually faster because it works through immediate downstream signaling. That means the two approaches are not true opposites so much as they are interventions at different depths. A precursor strategy is architectural. It attempts to make the body itself more capable of generating completion signals. A direct SPM strategy is tactical. It attempts to increase completion signaling now, even if the body is not yet structurally very good at producing that signal by itself. The question is therefore not which is universally better. The question is whether the need is immediate phase correction, long-term tissue remodeling, or both. This also reveals a hierarchy. Direct SPM supplementation may make the most sense when the body is profoundly stuck in inflammatory continuation and a stronger downstream resolution push is needed to help move the tissue out of recruitment-heavy logic. Precursor strategy may make the most sense when the core issue is poor membrane composition, long-term omega-6 dominance, weak omega-3, derived substrate pools, and chronically low resolution potential. In many real cases, the body likely needs both phases of thinking. It needs the reservoir rebuilt and the later phase signals strengthened. But if forced to choose which strategy builds more durable physiology, precursor strategy usually has the deeper reach because it changes the substrate library from which future inflammatory events will be written. Direct SPMs may be able to shift behavior transiently. EPA and DHA incorporation can shift the architecture of the behavior itself. Another important distinction is robustness. The body's own SPM generation occurs within tissue-specific contexts and in relationship to local phase timing. That means precursor-driven endogenous production has the advantage of being embedded in native control systems. Direct SPM supplementation, by contrast, is attempting to influence that system from the outside, which may still be useful, but it raises a different question. How well does an externally supplied pro-resolving mediator or analog match the timing, tissue localization, receptor engagement, stability, and concentration dynamics of the body's own internal mediator biology? Even if it produces benefit, it does not necessarily reproduce the full elegance of endogenous resolution signaling. The body is normally generating these mediators from local membranes in response to local events. Exogenous strategies may help, but they are not automatically identical to native physiology simply because they resemble part of its chemistry. Seen clearly, direct SPM supplementation and precursor strategy should be understood as interventions at different levels of the inflammatory sequence. Precursor strategy rebuilds the membrane reservoir, changes substrate competition, and increases long-horizon resolution potential from within. Direct SPM strategy attempts to strengthen the downstream stop signal more immediately, especially where endogenous conversion is weak or too slow to matter in the moment. The deeper lesson is that resolution biology cannot be reduced to either one alone. If the body is underbuilt structurally, direct signals may underperform. If the body is trapped in severe chronic escalation, precursor alone may take too long or remain too weakly expressed unless the downstream phase is also supported. The best framework is therefore not binary. It is layered. Build the reservoir, reduce omega-6 crowding, protect the membrane, support conversion, reduce re-triggering, and where appropriate strengthen the later phase instruction directly enough that the tissue can finally stop behaving as though the emergency is still open. Exogenous SPM products. Exogenous SPM products are products designed to supply specialized pro-resolving mediators or closely related downstream resolution compounds from outside the body rather than relying entirely on the body to generate them from EPA and DHA stored in membranes. In theory, they are meant to bypass one of the biggest bottlenecks in omega-3 biology, which is the long chain between precursor intake and actual later phase mediator production. Instead of asking the body to absorb omega-3, remodel membranes, release substrate, compete through COX and LOX pathways, and then generate enough resolvins, protectins, or marazins to matter, an exogenous SPM product attempts to deliver the later phase signal more directly. The attraction is obvious. If chronic inflammation is partly a problem of inadequate stop signal strength, then providing the stop signal itself appears more efficient than waiting for the body to build it from precursor. That said, these products should be understood as downstream interventions, not structural replacements for precursor strategy. They may help increase pro-resolving signaling pressure, but they do not rebuild membrane composition, do not displace omega-6, heavy phospholipid architecture, do not correct poor DHA or EPA incorporation, and do not by themselves restore the tissue reservoir from which the body is supposed to generate its own resolution chemistry over time. In other words, they can potentially influence the instruction layer without fully correcting the storage layer. That distinction matters because many chronically inflamed tissues are not suffering only from weak late-phase signaling. They are also suffering from poor membrane architecture, oxidative instability, repeated re-triggering, barrier dysfunction, and incomplete cleanup. An exogenous SPM product may help push the system toward closure, but it is still entering a tissue environment that may be structurally underprepared to obey that signal well. This is why exogenous SPM products make the most conceptual sense in situations where the central problem is weak downstream resolution pressure relative to persistent inflammatory activation. If the body still inflames strongly but does not generate enough convincing late-phase instruction to stop continued neutrophil traffic, improve macrophage finishing, and restore tissue order, then a direct pro-resolving signal strategy is at least mechanistically coherent. But it should not be mistaken for a complete substitute for membrane remodeling. A tissue that remains loaded with omega-6 dominant substrate, chronically oxidized lipids, uncleared debris, and repeated barrier-derived immune provocation may still underperform even when given a more direct stop signal. The body can receive the instruction and still struggle to carry it out. The deeper point is that exogenous SPM products are best understood as tactical rather than architectural. They may help change phase. They do not necessarily change the material basis from which future inflammatory phases will be built. Precursor strategy, by contrast, is slower and less direct, but it works on the reservoir itself by increasing EPA and DHA incorporation into phospholipids. So exogenous SPM products belong to the downstream end of the sequence, while omega-3 precursor strategy belongs to the upstream end. The most honest way to frame them is not as magic replacements for omega-3, but as attempts to strengthen one specific part of the resolution program, the signaling phase of closure, in bodies that may still need broader structural repair underneath. Stability and bioavailability challenges. Stability and bioavailability are the two main reasons exogenous SPM products are conceptually appealing but biologically difficult. The appeal is straightforward. If chronic inflammation reflects weak resolution signaling, then supplying resolvins, protectins, maresins, or related downstream mediators directly seems like a way to bypass slow membrane remodeling and weak endogenous conversion. The difficulty is that these molecules sit at the far end of a fragile lipid pathway. They are not robust compounds in the way many ordinary nutrients are. They are highly specialized lipid mediators that must remain chemically intact, survive formulation, survive storage, survive digestion if taken orally, cross into useful biological compartments, and reach tissues in forms and concentrations that still preserve their signaling identity. That is a demanding chain, and weakness at any point can turn a theoretically elegant strategy into a practically inconsistent one. The stability problem begins with the same feature that makes resolution biology possible in the first place. These compounds are built from highly unsaturated fatty acid precursors. That makes them chemically expressive, but it also makes them more vulnerable to degradation. Heat, light, oxygen exposure, time, manufacturing conditions, and storage conditions can all affect lipid-derived molecules long before they reach the body. With exogenous SPM-type products, that fragility matters more than it does with simple precursor oils because the goal is no longer merely to deliver fatty acids that the body can later process. The goal is to preserve a more advanced, already structured signaling compound. If that compound degrades, the product is not simply weaker in a general sense. It may no longer be delivering the same biological instruction at all. The closer one moves to the downstream end of lipid signaling, the more demanding chemical preservation becomes. Bioavailability is the second major problem. Even if the compound remains stable in the bottle, the body still has to receive it in a meaningful way. Oral delivery introduces immediate uncertainty. Lipid mediators must survive the digestive environment, avoid being lost to breakdown before absorption, and then enter circulation or local tissue spaces in forms that still permit useful receptor interaction. That is not trivial. A precursor strategy can tolerate some of this inefficiency because EPA and DHA are meant to be absorbed as fatty acids and then slowly incorporated into membranes over time. Exogenous SPM products are attempting something more delicate. They are trying to deliver later phase instruction directly. If digestion, emulsification, transport, or local metabolism distort that signal too heavily, then what reaches tissue may be less than what the label implies, or less biologically coherent than what the concept promises. Timing makes the challenge even more serious. Endogenous SPM production happens locally, in relationship to phase, in tissues that have already entered inflammatory activation and are shifting toward completion. That means natural SPM signaling is not just about the molecule itself. It is about where it appears, when it appears, and in what inflammatory context it appears. Exogenous delivery has a harder job because it must try to introduce that signal from outside the normal timing architecture. Even if some of the compound reaches circulation, it may not reproduce the same local concentration, receptor context, or phase-appropriate appearance that endogenous resolution signaling achieves. This does not mean exogenous products cannot work at all. It means they are operating at a disadvantage compared with a body generating pro-resolving mediators directly at the membrane site where inflammatory sequencing is already unfolding. There is also a tissue targeting problem. Different tissues express different needs, different receptor environments, and different cleanup burdens. A local inflammatory site in the gut, a vascular interface, a joint, or neural tissue does not necessarily respond identically to the same circulating pro-resolving signal. Endogenous production partly solves this by generating mediators where substrate was stored and where the event is happening. Exogenous products have to rely more heavily on systemic distribution and hope that enough intact signal reaches the right tissue at the right time. That makes consistent outcomes harder, especially in bodies carrying multiple simultaneous inflammatory burdens across several tissues. These challenges do not make the strategy meaningless. They simply make it conditional. A well-formulated exogenous SPM product may still provide useful downstream pressure toward closure, especially in a body that is poor at generating its own pro-resolving signals. But the strategy is inherently more sensitive to chemistry, delivery form, storage conditions, digestion, timing, and tissue context than people often assume. It is also why exogenous SPM products should not be mistaken for full substitutes for precursor strategy. Precursor strategy rebuilds the membrane reservoir and changes future inflammatory potential from the structural level upward. Exogenous SPM products try to strengthen the late-phase signal more directly, but they still depend on that signal remaining stable enough to survive delivery and biologically available enough to influence tissue behavior after arrival. Seen clearly, stability and bioavailability challenges are not side issues. They are the core practical limits of exogenous SPM strategies. The closer an intervention gets to the body's own native late-phase signaling chemistry, the more elegant it becomes in theory and the more fragile it becomes in practice. That is why direct SPM approaches may be useful as tactical tools, but why they remain difficult to rely on as complete solutions. The body does not only need the right signal. It needs that signal intact, delivered, received, and acted on inside tissue, still capable of resolution. Precursor-based versus direct delivery. Precursor-based delivery and direct delivery differ at the level of where they intervene in the resolution sequence. Precursor-based delivery supplies EPA and DHA and asks the body to do the rest. Those fatty acids must be absorbed, incorporated into phospholipid membranes, preserved there as part of the tissue reservoir, released during inflammatory activation, and then converted downstream into resolvins, protectins, and marazins if the tissue reaches the later phase strongly enough to support that conversion. Direct delivery tries to skip part of that chain by supplying downstream pro-resolving molecules or compounds positioned much closer to them, rather than relying entirely on endogenous conversion from stored membrane substrate. In simple terms, precursor strategy rebuilds the library. Direct delivery tries to supply part of the message. The advantage of precursor-based strategy is depth. It changes the membrane itself. Over time, it can alter the phospholipid reservoir, shift substrate competition away from omega-6 dominance, improve the structural environment around receptors and enzymes, and increase the body's own capacity to generate resolution signals locally when inflammation occurs. That makes it more architectural and potentially more durable. It does not merely add a later phase instruction. It changes the tissue from which later phase instruction will be derived in the future. The limitation is that it is slow, indirect, and highly dependent on good absorption, good membrane incorporation, low enough oxidative stress, enough enzymatic conversion, and a tissue environment that actually reaches mediator class switching rather than remaining trapped in repeated escalation. The advantage of direct delivery is immediacy. It aims closer to the resolution signal itself, which means it may help in situations where endogenous conversion is weak, where the body is stuck in chronic inflammatory continuation, or where waiting for slow membrane remodeling is not enough by itself. Conceptually, it applies more pressure to the late phase. The limitation is that it does not rebuild the structural reservoir. It may strengthen the stop signal without correcting the membrane imbalance, omega-6 crowding, barrier instability, oxidative fragility, or mitochondrial weakness that caused poor resolution in the first place. It is also more vulnerable to formulation, stability, timing, and bioavailability problems because downstream lipid mediators are more fragile than their precursors and harder to deliver intact in a biologically meaningful way. So the real difference is not which one is universally better. It is that precursor-based delivery works upstream and direct delivery works downstream. Precursor strategy is better at changing what kind of tissue the body is built from. Direct delivery is better at trying to change what that tissue is being told to do right now. In a body that is structurally underbuilt for resolution, precursor strategy has the deeper reach. In a body that needs stronger late-phase signaling because it is stuck in inflammatory continuation, direct delivery is more targeted in principle. The strongest framework is layered rather than binary. Rebuild the membrane reservoir, reduce omega-6 competition, improve oxidative stability and barrier control, and where needed strengthen downstream resolution signaling enough that the body can finally move from escalation into completion. Clinical implications. The clinical implications of this entire framework are substantial because it changes what chronic inflammatory illness is understood to be. If inflammation is viewed only as excessive immune activity, then treatment naturally centers on suppression. The goal becomes reducing cytokines, reducing pain, reducing swelling, reducing visible biochemical output. Sometimes that is necessary, and sometimes it provides meaningful relief. But if chronic inflammation is more accurately understood as failed resolution, then symptom reduction alone is no longer enough to define success. A quieter tissue is not necessarily a completed tissue. The deeper clinical question becomes whether the body is actually regaining the ability to stop recruiting, clear debris, restore barriers, normalize vascular behavior, stabilize membranes, and return the site to state that no longer keeps re-triggering inflammatory interpretation. This changes how persistent symptoms should be read. Chronic pain, fatigue, brain fog, vascular irritability, metabolic dysfunction, autoimmune flares, gut reactivity, and poor tissue recovery stop looking like isolated clinical categories and begin looking like different expressions of unresolved inflammatory architecture. The clinician or practitioner is no longer asking only what signal is elevated. The more useful question becomes what phase is failing. Is the tissue over-initiating because thresholds are too low? Is it failing to clear debris because macrophage cleanup is inadequate? Is it remaining chemically noisy because membrane composition is poor and omega-3 derived resolution substrate is underrepresented? Is barrier dysfunction feeding fresh provocation into a site that should already be closing? Is mitochondrial strain preventing the body from paying for the labor of completion? These are clinically important distinctions because each one points to a different therapeutic leverage point. It also changes what counts as progress. If this model is right, then true improvement is not just lower inflammatory intensity. It is stronger resolution capacity. That means fewer flares from minor triggers, faster recovery after stress, lower persistence of pain after the useful protective phase should have passed, better tolerance of ordinary foods and activities, more stable energy, and less evidence that tissues remain partially defensive between episodes. In other words, a patient is not only better when symptoms are lower in the moment. They are better when their baseline threshold has risen, their tissue quiet has improved, and their body is less likely to re-enter the same inflammatory program from small inputs. Clinically, that is a very different standard from short-term suppression. There are also important implications for omega-3 use itself. The framework argues against treating omega-3 as a generic anti-inflammatory supplement and argues for using it as a structural and phase-specific tool. It suggests that EPA-forward strategies may be more relevant when persistent inflammatory traffic, vascular irritation, and repeated early-phase recruitment dominate, while DHA-forward strategies may be more relevant when neural instability, membrane fragility, poor tissue protection, and weak cleanup dominate. It also suggests that precursor strategy alone may be too weak in severely stuck inflammatory states unless the broader terrain is changed at the same time, especially omega-6 competition, oxidative burden, barrier leak, and mitochondrial insufficiency. Clinically, that means omega-3 should be matched to the failure pattern rather than prescribed as a one-size-fits-all nutrient. This framework also makes clear that chronic inflammatory patients often need more than one layer of support at once. If the membrane reservoir is poor, omega-3 substrate must be rebuilt. If omega-6 dominance is high, competition must be reduced. If oxidative injury is high, membrane protection has to improve. If barriers are leaking, fresh provocation has to be lowered. If cleanup is inadequate, macrophage finishing and tissue-level resolution need support. If energy production is weak, repair capacity has to be restored or the body will continue to start reactions it cannot afford to finish. The clinical implication is that resolution failure is a systems problem. That means care has to become architecture-aware, not just marker-aware. Perhaps the most important implication is diagnostic in spirit, even when not formalized in laboratory language. It suggests that many chronic conditions are best understood not as diseases of too much defense, but as diseases of incomplete defense. The body is still trying to protect itself. It's just doing so through tissues that have become poor at closure. That reframing matters because it changes the posture of treatment from silencing to completion, from volume control to sequence restoration, from fighting inflammation as an enemy to rebuilding the body's ability to finish inflammation as a program. Clinically, that is a more useful model because it aligns symptoms, membrane biology, lipid balance, barrier function, mitochondrial capacity, and recovery behavior into one coherent picture rather than leaving them as separate, unexplained problems.